Story 1. There have been quite a few strange and sometimes frightening incidents in my life. I will tell you about one of them. About 4 years ago, when I was 16 years old, there was an incident after which every time before going to bed several times, I check whether the door is closed on the lock. That day I invited a friend over for a sleepover. I was living with my parents at the time, but they had a sleepover at a friend's house. So it was just the three of us, me, my older brother who was 17 at the time, and my friend. My brother hung out with us for a while and went to bed because he had to get up early in the morning. My friend and I sat in my room watching YouTube and talking. Closer to 2 a.m., my friend started to fall asleep. He fell asleep very quickly. I did not want to sleep and continued to watch videos. Suddenly, from outside the house, heard a noise. I did not give it any importance, as the neighbors' cats often climb on our coal at night. And since the coal is covered with sheet iron, all this is accompanied by a deafening metallic ringing, just as I heard then. Then about 5 minutes later, a barely perceptible shadow flashed past the window in front of which I have a monitor. It happened so fast that in any other situation I would have thought I was imagining it. But two suspicious events within a few minutes seemed strange. Immediately I got up from my chair and went to the front door, and damn it, not one of the two locks was locked. What happened next was something that almost made me shit my pants. After locking both locks, I decided to turn on the yard light and look through the peephole. When I looked through the peephole, there was a face in front of it. I cried out, "Damn," and jumped away from the door. Behind the door was the face of a man about 25-30 years old, who was standing close to the peephole. I looked through the peephole again to get a closer look at the stranger, and then he spoke. The stranger asked me to let him in, said he needed help, but you know what was the creepiest part? His emotions, or should I say his complete lack thereof. The stranger's words sounded very convincing. There was real fear in his voice, as if he really needed urgent help on which his life depended. But his face showed absolutely no emotion. Nothing but lip movement. A completely blank stare. I was unrealistically creepy. I just stood there looking at him. And with each passing second, he begged to be let in even louder, with more fear in his voice. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, I saw my brother, and I didn't even immediately notice how the stranger stopped talking. My brother asked me, "What are you doing?" I answered that someone had broken into our yard, and then I looked through the peephole again. There was no one in front of the door. What the hell? I thought to myself. I told my brother that I had just seen a man at the door and that he had asked me to let him in. He believed me and said that he had seen someone at the window too, but thought he had imagined it. After that, we turned off the lights in the house and looked through the windows trying to find the stranger, but there was no one there. Suddenly from my room there is a wild scream of my friend. My brother and I fly into the room and see that at the window in my room stands that man, with the same emotionless face, but his look has changed from empty to predatory. Despite the fact that the yard light was on and the house was dark and he couldn't see us, he looked right into my eyes. I was stunned with horror, and then he gives the first and only emotion. His face stretches in a wide smile. He raises his hand to the level of his face. In his hand you can see a heavy knife. Slowly bringing the knife to the window, he began methodically tapping the tip of the knife on the glass while continuing to smile creepily. At that moment, my brother was already talking to the dispatcher on the phone, calling the police. I don't know why we didn't do it earlier. For some unknown reason, none of us had any idea to call the police before. As soon as my brother finished talking to the dispatcher, we ran to another room. None of us had no desire to stay in the room outside the window where this crazy man was standing. The cops arrived about 10 minutes later, but there was no one in the yard. This psycho ran away. From our words, the police made a sketch of the stranger. The staff contacted our parents and stayed with them until they arrived. Despite the fact that there were reports of this psycho all over the city, he was never caught. How grateful I am to my intuition for thinking to check if the door was closed, and to my father for his caution. Every window in our house has bars. Who knows what would have happened if they were not there. Story 2. I live with my mom and younger brother. My parents are divorced and I don't see my dad anymore. We lived in a 20-plus story apartment. I was 8 years old at the time, and my mom and brother were out on their own, so I was often alone at home. By this time I had adapted to live alone, and the fact that I was alone in the apartment did not scare me. But there was one moment. My aunt with her daughter, 15 years old, and son, 12 years old, asked to move in with us as their apartment was taken away from them because of debts. My family took them in and we started living together. One day, my aunt's eldest daughter wanted to summon some spirit she saw on the internet. I thought something like Chucky, Queen of Spades, but no. She had a piece of paper with a pencil on top of another to twist, and the answers were yes or no. After we had fun, we threw that piece of paper away and never remembered again. But when I started to stay home alone, I started to hear some rustling, rumbling, and heavy objects falling all the time. I was very much frightened, but I did not tell anyone, as they would not believe me and considered me crazy. The next morning, when everyone sat down to breakfast, my aunt began to behave strangely. She was constantly moving, looking around, and there was an unimaginable horror on her face. It turned out that all ate first and left, and I with my aunt stayed in the kitchen. At one point she asks, "You also saw him?" I was surprised and thought, here is my chance to tell everything that was going on in my soul. After I told her, she was horrified, and the next week she moved with her kids to some dorm. I told my mom everything, and surprisingly, she also believed me, and we sold the apartment and moved out. Story 3. This is the story of my older sister. We have a dacha, and next to the cemetery, about 500 meters away, is quite large. A lot of different creepy things happened at the country house, but this story is the most memorable. Behind the fence of the dacha village, there was a forest, and there equipped something like a playground, put a tennis table, swings hung up. My sister, at that time she was about 16, 17 years old, often hung out there with her country house friends. They went there with a friend to listen to music loudly so as not to disturb anyone, to play cards. Next to the gate and the fence separating the country house from the forest. To get to the site, they had to get under the gate on their stomachs because it had a lock on it, and the rest of the dense forest. Well, in short, they are sitting laughing, and my sister hears strange sounds in the forest, as if a bunch of squirrels climbing one tree. There was no wind, and she became scared. She got up abruptly, turned off the music, and told her friend that they had to leave, under the pretext that they would soon be found by their relatives for dinner. They climbed over, stepped away from the fence, but at the same time they both froze, watching what was happening. Something tree-like, of gigantic proportions right through the woods began, as if to float, across the entire area next to the table where they were sitting. They don't know how long it all lasted, but they looked at each other and rushed home. That was about 13 years ago, but they still talk and recount what they saw with real horror. Still can't find a logical explanation. Story 4. I grew up in an old village where the police would see you once a week and they wouldn't help you. One day when I was bored, I went outside at night, and for nothing. When I walked about 100 meters away from the house, I felt someone's gaze in the total darkness where there was not a soul. There were some rustling noises, but I did not pay any attention to it, but I still had to approach because I dropped a valuable coupon. In our village, for one coupon in the early 2000s, you could easily buy things up to $100. When I went to pick up the coupon, I realized where I had the feeling that I was being watched. There was a man about 40 and 2 meters tall and 2 little girls about 11 years old. I was going to be 15 in a month. I looked at them and saw that they were obviously one with each other. The man saw me and wouldn't leave me alone. After a second, I felt a kind of relief, as if my body had become light. When I woke up, I couldn't scream from the pain. I was tied up so tightly that the rope was pressing on my kidneys. Without going into details, I was abused. At that moment, the cloth covering my eyes slipped off and I saw only this man walking away, and I remembered him clearly and what he did to me. After that moment, my parents, of course, started to ask what happened to me, and I told them that I fought against the crowd and failed. Soon I was taken to the hospital where I was diagnosed with nephropathy, which is when the kidney is out of place, and I know why. I still have the indentation from the rope. Good thing the other kidney wasn't affected. After that moment, I was 18 and moved to the city to study. Being in the 3rd year of engineering, I was surrounded by good friends. One day with one of my friends, I went to a not very popular bar, although I myself was not a fan of alcohol. Because after moving to the city, I became active in sports and wrestling. I decided to keep my friend company, and eventually he got drunk that I had to drive him to his car. When we left the bar, I heard a very familiar voice. I put my friend in the back seat and told him I'd be there in a minute. I looked around and saw a man with a pole and a very familiar voice going into the alley to take a piss. Remembering my childhood trauma and wanting revenge, I followed him. Luckily, he was alone and there was no ambush. When I saw him, I was sure it was him. I couldn't help myself and started hitting him and hitting him again. Even with a pipe that was lying by the garbage can, I didn't give myself a second to talk to him. The bottom line of this story is that when I got in the car and drove away, a guy from the bar called an ambulance and the man was taken to the hospital. His body was full of wounds, and he went into a long coma because of a skull injury. The chance of his survival was less than that of a person with cancer that was inherited and not weakened in some way. Story 5. Once when I was about 11, I stayed home by myself. Back then I was a huge fan of all things mystical and paranormal. And that's when I watched the then popular pony scary movie, The Mirror. In a nutshell, it's about how you and your reflection are not the same thing. There were several ways to prove it to yourself. For example, turn off the light, quickly cut off a strand of hair, turn on the light, and compare the length of the strands. If you notice that the hair lengths don't match, don't let it show. Pretend that everything is fine and calmly walk away from the mirror. Now he knows you know. Of course, I knew it was all made up, but again, I was very interested. Anyway, after this video, some time passed and I decided to make faces at the mirror. Having already forgotten about this video, sometimes I get nervous tics and my head can turn either right or left without warning. This one was one of those times. I'm out there dancing, messing around, and then my head abruptly turns to the right because of a nervous tic. And I turn my head back almost instantly. And oh my God, I swear I said I saw my reflection still looking to the right. But just a second later, it was looking at me again, and I felt someone else's gaze on me like I was being stared right into my soul. I instantly remembered that scary story, and I stepped away from the mirror. I was afraid to go near them until my mom came home from work at night. I have another creepy story when I was at home by myself with a friend, but it's also very long and won't fit in this post.